In this video, we're going to introduce the JPA, which is an API specification. JPA means Jakarta Persistence API, and before that it was known as Java Persistence API. And it is a specification that defines how to manage relational data in enterprise Java applications, and it uses the object relational mapping design pattern. Now please remember that JPA is not a framework, it is merely a specification. And that means that it doesn't actually do anything, it just defines what implementations must do if they are going to implement JPA. If we want to use JPA, we will need to obtain an implementation of that specification. And an implementation of JPA is called a persistence provider, because it will provide functionality to store or persist data in a database and then retrieve it and create domain objects from that data, as we discussed in the previous video. There are quite a few implementations of the JPA specification, and some of the popular ones include those that you can see on screen. Spring Data provides a JPA dependency. It's not an actual implementation of the JPA specification, but it supports all of the available JPA implementations. And that's possible because by using the specification, we are able to plug in an implementation of the specification and use it, and then unplug that persistence provider and plug in another one, and it will still work very nicely. Now there are quite a few parts to the JPA. There's the API itself that we would then use to map and store and update and retrieve data, essentially to maintain the consistency between the Java objects in our program and relational databases in both directions. There's also the persistence query language, known as the JPQL, and that it allows us to write queries if the standard queries are not quite what we need for a particular interaction with the database. There's also the persistence metadata. Now this is very important because it defines the mapping between the objects in our program and the database tables. And we can do that with annotations or XML. In this module, we're going to use annotations. Some of the components that we need in JPA include entity, entity manager, and indeed others. The entity represents one table, and each instance of that entity, so when we have an object of that entity class, that will correspond to one row in the corresponding table. And we will use annotations that we put into the entity class that will define the object relational mapping. And we write this bit of code. The entity manager is our doorway into the persistence provider, and it provides all the persistence operations that we need. So we will call its methods, passing entity objects to it. Now there are other components, and you might want to do some background reading about those. This diagram illustrates some of those components, and the bit that we're really interested in is the entity. These classes here are the only ones of this diagram that we actually write as the developer of the application. So do a little bit more background reading about JPA and its architecture. It will be very useful information for you to gather.